Do you guys remember Remix? You know, that alternative to Next.js that everybody was hyped about that nobody used, but then suddenly OpenAI started using it, but then they killed it, but then Shopify bought it, and it's now kind of in limbo? It's been a weird journey with Remix. It started as a wrapper for React Router that was meant to be a template you would pay for. It then slowly became a framework, and it's since spiraled into all sorts of different things. It was put to sleep for a little bit, taking a nap, as they like to say. And now, after almost, a year and a half or so, it's back. And it's back in a really interesting way. The most interesting detail is that they are leaving behind React. Yes, really. Remix v3 will not be built on React. This is a massive shift, not just for the Remix team, not just for Shopify, but potentially for how we should be thinking about building for the web as a whole. And I know a lot of you are going to think, oh, Theo's going to hate on this a ton because I'm a huge React fanboy and I've never been a big Remix fan. I actually think there's a lot of good stuff in this plan, and I am genuinely really excited to see where this goes. But since none of these people are paying me, not even big React, we got to pay the bill somehow. So quick word from today's sponsor, and then we'll dive right in.
Stop me if you've been here before. You're working on a new side project or app. You have a thing that you really want to get out there, and then you have to set up auth. Now you're stuck in some weird old Google dashboard trying to set up OAuth. You're 15 steps in and nothing is working and you just want to die. Today's sponsor is here to make all of that way easier. Clerk's made my life managing auth so much better that it significantly increased the number of projects that I was actually getting out there. Even just a few days ago, I was working on an alternative to Pocket, was going through hell and back trying to get auth working, said screw it, spun up Clerk, and had it done in minutes instead of days. It's so nice. The dev experience is nuts because they have all of the keys already set up for you, so you don't even have to set things up in those different dashboards. You just install the package and you're good to go. One of my favorite things they recently added is this copy prompt button, so it's even easier to get started. You copy the prompt, you go to your IDE of choice that has AI integrations, you open this up, you hit paste, you hit enter, and then it will set up Clerk for you. It's really that easy now. I've tried pretty much every solution for auth, and Clerk is still the best developer experience by far, especially for us Next.js devs. They make things so easy. And one last little thing that I really like, they bill per monthly active users, but they don't count users the way that other services do. A user isn't somebody who went to your site once and left like it is everywhere else. You're never charged for users who sign up and don't come back. So a user doesn't count unless they've shown up twice in a 24-hour window. This is so generous, and it also helps a lot for people like me who build dev tools that people sign into once, get their API key, and then don't go back to the dashboard. You can keep your numbers hilariously low depending on how you build your stuff. Theo, are you really sitting here telling people how to abuse the sponsor of today's episode? Yes, I am, because they get it and they don't care. If you want to see how good auth can feel as a developer, check them out today at soydev.link/clerk. First and foremost, we need to understand the relationship between Remix and React Router. As I mentioned before, Remix largely stemmed out of React Router. React Router happened because as great as React was when it dropped, there were a lot of fundamental pieces that were missing. It didn't really have recommendations for state management beyond the basic state key existing inside of components. As such, Redux happened as a way of thinking about state in your React applications. They had no concept of processing a URL and rendering different components for different pages. As such, React Router was made. React Router was made by two important characters, Michael Jackson, yes, really, and Ryan Florence. These two came from the Ember community. Ember.js was a JavaScript framework that was more cohesive, all-in-one, recommending a full stack way of building. Not as much on the back end, but the more angular-y, they recommended all the parts. And when these two came to React, funny enough, the main reason was actually performance, because it was really hard to make performant things in Ember, like a search that would update whenever you pressed a new key. Basically impossible to do concisely with Ember at the time. Apparently the framework's improved since. I don't know, because all the people I talk to who use Ember only use Ember, and most of them don't even like it. I haven't heard anybody from outside of the Ember community heavily pitch it for a bit. So it's not a thing I think too much about. And all the best Ember people I knew moved off into other communities. Michael Jackson and Ryan Florence were two of those people. They came from the Ember community and embraced React relatively early for the performance improvements, but they saw that there were many things missing, one of which was a router. So they built it. They made React Router to be the missing piece for turning a URL into the correct components in your application. As such, they expected it to blow up, and it did. If I recall,
6 out of 10 React apps use React Router. At the very, very least, 6 out of 10 npm install React calls would be mirrored with a install React Router. So for every 10 React installs from npm, 6 React Router installs would happen. It was massive. But there was an important thing. The React team never officially recommended React Router. At no point did the React team make React Router an official recommendation. It was never included in Create React App. It was never mentioned in the docs. React Router, despite being universal, despite being incredibly popular, despite being pretty effectively ubiquitous for a while, it never became the official recommendation. And there is definitely some resentment sitting deeply as a result of that. And I understand it too. Imagine making something that popular, that well-regarded, that essential, and not recommending it as React. I can absolutely feel the pain that they felt, and I understand it. And I don't fault them for it at all. For a combination of reasons. The fact that they were regularly consulting with different companies, a lot of the money that they made at the time was doing workshops with businesses to help them make their React code bases less shitty. We actually did one of those at Twitch, and I didn't get to do it because I was already onboarded on React, and they wanted to not spend more money on seats. So they sent people who needed more help learning React to go to the camp. But I didn't even really know who Ryan Florence was at the time. I probably wouldn't have benefited as much from it. But it was really cool that they would go to these different companies to give boot camps to get people using React correctly. They ended up seeing all the ways you could use React wrong as they did these tours across these many different companies. And they wanted to rethink it. They wanted to rethink what building with React looks like. You could say they wanted to remix it. I'm sorry, I had to do the pun. That's what Remix was built for. Remix was the best possible starting point for building your big React project. They had seen all the pain points that these companies were having, from massive compilation times, hot reloads that barely worked, giant waterfalls of data preventing things from actually loading properly in the browser. They saw all these pain points and decided it was time to make a better starting point. But that's all Remix was originally. Michael and Ryan built Remix with the very specific goal of being the ultimate Create React app alternative, both because they saw all the mistakes these companies were making, but also because they felt a little burned that React Router wasn't part of Create React app. So Remix was originally a paid template alternative to Create React app. You would pay a yearly fee for access to it. They'd give you the GitHub repo, and you could use that to start your new project. And they made a couple crazy bets. They bet really heavily on ESBuild, which was super new at the time. ESBuild was the first of these modern bundler tools. It was written in Go by the CTO of Figma at the time to try and make their build times less shit. And it was really, really fast, but it didn't really have a plugin architecture at all, which meant they had to build a ton of pieces in order to get ESBuild to properly bundle and create your React app. They built a crazy server-side loader pattern so that your components could run on the server once, generate a page, and then send that HTML down to the client so you'd have something before the JavaScript picked up. So you could have better SEO, better overall performance, and also much more logical data loading patterns. They went really hard on their data loaders at a route level because, again, they built the router, and they saw people fetching data in components, knew that was wrong, and wanted to move as much as possible up from the components into the router. So in some ways, Remix was like, what if React Router took over your whole stack? In other ways, Remix was, what if we rethought your starting point for React to be as good as possible? But a huge portion of it is, how can we set companies up to be more likely to succeed and also make some money for our contributions? And it happened. And a lot of people, myself included, had their critiques. The thing I was most frustrated about is that since it was a paid thing and it was closed source, I couldn't properly review it and critique it because I'd have to buy a license. And then if I wanted to share what was good and bad about it, I would have to either share the source code, which would potentially violate the license that I'm paying for, or I would have to tell people to go look at it and they'd have to pay for it to even verify my claims. So it made it really hard to critique. When you put things behind paywalls, they are much, much harder to have a community conversation about. They expanded the team a bit. They brought on Kent Dodds to be like their head of education in DX. They ramped up on the documentation. They ramped up on everything. They then took some investment money from OSS Fund, which is an open source focused investing firm. And then they open sourced it. And that was the point where I and many others started to look more actively into Remix. But it is also of note that during this time, React Router wasn't really being iterated on. So while they were building Remix, React Router kind of sat. A lot of the things they did in Remix could be beneficial even without the server-side rendering parts, even without the ES build parts, even without all that. So they started making adjustments to React Router to bring in more of those features, and they succeeded. React Router 7 was a phenomenal release, genuinely really, really good router, and I was pumped to see the progress that they had made after letting it stagnate for so long. They also realized they didn't really have a way to make money with this, and they were quickly losing the war to Next.js, which had exploded at the time. When they started Remix, Next.js was barely being used. When they got acquired by Shopify, Next.js was massive. As such, when they were given the offer to join Shopify, they took it. The reason Shopify bought them is because they were working on their own thing in parallel, Hydrogen, Shopify's React meta framework. Fun fact, Hydrogen was the first one to really bet heavily on server-side rendering using React server components. And they bet on a really early version of server components way before they were ready to be used. Got burnt really bad by that, and since then, backed away from the React standard stuff entirely. It is worth noting that at the time, with the three options being Remix, Hydrogen, and Next, Hydrogen was the one building most closely along the lines of what the React team wanted. Next.js was kind of, but not as much so. And Remix was kind of building away from React. So you had building along React, building alongside React, but not directly with it, and then building the opposite way. Those were the three options. Hydrogen felt burnt because server components were not ready, and Hydrogen slowly just fell apart. They felt so burned at Shopify, they decided to put their money where their mouth was and acquire Remix, which was the opposite direction. And then Next.js went off and worked much more closely with the React team. We all know that story, hopefully, by now. Remix, now part of Shopify, didn't have to worry about winning the whole market with Remix anymore. But they did have to worry about making the things that people were using survive, because a lot of companies, including Shopify, had bet heavily on React Router. So after Shopify acquired them, they started working more heavily on React Router again. That's when they brought in all these features. That's when they brought in some people to heavily work on moving away from their ES build plugin hell in favor of building on top of Vite, which didn't exist when Remix started. Vite had happened in the interim while all this chaos was being sorted on the server rendering side. So they ended up effectively rethinking Remix as a Vite plugin for React Router. And that went really well. There was a very happy path for Remix users to move off of Remix v2 onto React Router v7 with Vite that a lot of people took. And that's how the code base at OpenAI is currently structured. But by doing that, they effectively killed Remix. And the goal was to do that in order to give them the room to rethink of what Remix was, to remix it once again. They added a ton of features to React Router. It got way better. I'm very happy with the result. And then they started exploring server components. Ryan Florence even gave a talk at the last React conference about the server component stuff they were doing that was super, super cool. And then they started going deeper on the implementation. They started to get more and more frustrated. And it seems like as a result, they've decided to exit entirely. And that's how we get to the article that they just dropped. Wake up, Remix. At React Conf last summer, we announced that Remix was going to take a nap. Remix v2 had become such a thin wrapper around React Router that an artificial separation developed between the two projects. We simplified the project by moving the bundler and the server runtime code from Remix directly into React Router v7, merging everything that made Remix great into React Router v7's framework mode. We also announced that we'd be adding limited support for server components into React Router. We finished that work, releasing v7 last November and previewing RSC support last week. This provides a stable platform with long-term support for anyone who built on Remix v1 or v2, or on any previous version of React Router. I can confirm that because I'm using React Router for T3 chat, and I originally wrote it the way that I wrote React Router back when I was at Twitch in fucking 2018, and it worked exactly the same, and it was great. You could use the old React Router syntax all the same. So now, it's time to go wake up Remix. First, header. React Router is really good. When we set out to evolve Remix, we expected it to become a full-stack RSC-first React framework, fresh take on the full-stack React architecture. But something unexpected happened along the way. React Router v7 became really, really good. As I mentioned before, they'd kind of stopped focusing on React Router because they felt like it wasn't getting the respect and attention it deserved. But when they let the rest of the people come in after the Shopify acquisition, they ran so far with React Router v7 that it became everything Remix was and more. And as such, They didn't really want to do what React Router was doing with Remix. They wanted to let it be its own thing, and that's why we're here now. Thanks to the work on server component support in React Router, we now have a smooth incremental adoption path that supports returning server components directly from loaders and actions. We even built a first-class story for server-only routes, something we originally imagined to be part of the new Remix chapter. If all your routes are server routes, React Router v7 already feels a lot like where Remix was headed. The differences are subtle, not structural. And it's not just technically solid, it's battle-tested. React Router now powers apps at Shopify, X.com, GitHub, ChatGPT, Linear, T3Chat, and countless others. That's an awesome set of companies, isn't it? I did give feedback on this article before it was published. I did do a pass on the draft when Ryan sent it to me. T3Chat was in it before he even knew I knew this was happening. So that was there already. I didn't ask him to put that in, even though I did a proofing pass on it. Anyways, it's just one minor release away from fully supporting the complete React architecture. It's a dedicated team, long-term backing, and an open governance model to keep it growing for years to come. That's another big thing they just announced. Since React Router is so important to the community as it stands today, they don't want it to be fully owned by Ryan and Michael. They want to let the community run it, so they're moving it to an open governance model, which is awesome. Really exciting to see. I've definitely felt as though they wanted to take a step away from React Router for a while, and this is them formalizing it in a way that keeps it from dying, which is really, really good. What does this all mean for Remix? It means they're free. Specifically, it means they're free to build what they want to build next. A new path. Over the past few years, the web has made remarkable progress, and so have the tools that we use to build on it. But as much as we've gained, we've also seen complexity grow in ways that feel heavy. At times, modern web development can feel more like navigating a tool chain than building for the web. I have spent way too much time in Webpack configs and weird build hell. Couldn't agree more. We've had ideas that felt too disruptive to pursue in the past. But with Remix no longer tied to a specific paradigm, we have the freedom to explore them now. Remix v3 is a reimagining of what a web framework can be. A fresh foundation, shaped by decades of experience building for the web. Our focus is on simplicity, clarity, and performance, without giving up the power developers need. A modular toolkit that works well together, but it can also stand on its own. From first-class database drivers to a built-in component library. Turns out they're bringing back Reach UI. This isn't just a new version, it's a new direction. One that's faster, simpler, and closer to the web itself. In order to do this, we need to own the full stack, without leaning on layers of abstraction that we don't control. That means no critical dependencies, not even React. We're starting with a fork of Preact, which is a mature virtual DOM library already used heavily at Shopify, Google, and countless others. If you're not already familiar with Preact, it was built to be like minimal React, open source, way back. Funny enough, the guy who made it worked at Meta for a while. He might still. But it was always meant to be like mini React. They have really strict rules in the code base where if you ever add things, you have to remove enough to keep it under its like 3 kilobyte threshold, if I recall. Preact is fascinating. Cool to see them using that as a building block. But the important piece here isn't Preact, it's fork. They want everything to be owned by this one piece. If you ever wish for a development experience that feels lighter, faster, and more aligned with how the web actually works, Remix v3 is going to be built for you. This is another one of the things that I think Remix did really well. If you've ever seen one of Ryan Florence's talks, you understand. He cares so deeply about how the web and the browser interact and the nature of how data is loaded into the web page and how interfacing with the web works. He deeply cares about it. He doesn't have a strong positive or negative stance on web standards. He just thinks we should follow them because they exist. And he has given some of my favorite talks ever. Of my top 5 talks ever, he did 2 of them. Ryan cares very, very deeply about doing that type of thing right. And every time a change happens in one of the dependencies he relies on, he has to obsess over the details to make sure it doesn't break the delicate relationship between the server, the browser, and the user. But if he owns the whole thing, his obsession over the details can be turned into ownership of the details, which is something he's wanted for a long time. Where this gets really interesting, though, is the principles. They are doing things different in a way that I've theorized, but I haven't seen anyone commit to. That's very exciting. The first point here, you'll understand why I'm excited. Model first development. AI fundamentally shifts the human-computer interaction model for both user experience and developer workflows. Optimize the source code, documentation, tooling, and abstractions for LLMs and not just humans. Additionally, Develop abstractions for applications to use models in the product itself, not just as a tool to develop it. Do you know how rough all of these frameworks are when you want to stream a generated response or you want to update the UI whenever a new token comes in? All of them suck. I have had to fight React Router. I've had to fight Next.js. I even had to fight Solid in Svelte when I tried. The slowest and worst performing AI chat app I ever used was written in Svelte. So none of these tools do this well. None of them provide the primitives that make building an AI product good, and few of them provide the pieces that make building with AI good either. As such, we kind of just use React because it's what there's the most source of available, which is why all the models can do it better. But if the framework was built to be simple, concise, and follow either web standards or really simple single path like solutions, LLMs could theoretically get really good at these more minimal frameworks, as long as they provide a solution to every problem and they don't pull in random shit all of the time. The idea of a framework built around models, both to make products for LLMs better and also to make developing against it with LLMs better, is actually really exciting. It's why I think Convex is really good now more than ever, because they're proper infrastructure as code. So everything you'd want to do is just source code, which means the LLM can generate stuff much more effectively. It's interesting to see someone building with that in mind from the start, and I'm excited to see where they go with it. The next point is building on web APIs. I already talked about this, but they really like these standards. Not that they think that they are great, but they think it is great they exist, and they want to use them as much as they can. So rather than doing different patterns on the server versus the client, they want to use web APIs as much as possible, so you don't have to remember there's a different version of this thing when you're in the node file versus when you're in the client file. Another point I think is really cool is the religiously runtime piece. They don't want to use a bunch of compiler tricks to make stuff work. As incredible and elegant and powerful as server components are, they require very delicate intervention from the bundler to split things up properly and turn it into this weird machine that calls web APIs to fetch data from the server and embed it in the right place in the browser. They don't want any of that. They want the code you write to be very, very close to the code you run. Ideally, the only difference is you remove the type definitions and you turn the JSX into real functions. That's about it. They also, as I mentioned before, really want to avoid dependencies. They are tired of dealing with other people's roadmaps. Choose them wisely, wrap them completely, and expect to replace most of them with your own package eventually. The goal is 0. Fascinating. Excited to see where that goes for them. Point 5 is that they demand composition. Abstractions should be single purpose and replaceable. A composition abstraction is easy to add and remove from an existing program. Every package must be useful and documented independent of any other context. New features should first be attempted as a new package. If impossible, attempt to break up the existing packages to make it more composable. However, tightly coupled modules that almost always change together in both directions should be moved to the same package. And the last point, distribute cohesively. Extremely composable ecosystems are difficult to learn and use. Therefore, the package will be wrapped up in a single package as dependencies and then re-exported as a single toolbox, which will be Remix. Exciting. This is a very, very promising future. As I hinted at throughout, I had a long chat with Ryan about this, and he got me pretty hyped about the way he's thinking about things. The framing I gave that he ended up really agreeing with was, nobody's really rethought Express since React and TypeScript happened. We have thought a lot about what does it look like to run React on the server. We've thought a lot about the shape of the API using things like tRPC, but the idea of a route hasn't been challenged meaningfully. And the idea of a server-side framework that is focused not just on responding with JSON or HTML files, but is focused on responding with unique, useful context depending on the need of the application. There hasn't really been an application-first Express that has all the stuff that we need. And that's one of the parts that they're thinking of here. And then when you do that, if you start from the server that takes in the request to the URL, and you rethink everything from there to the user's response to the thing that renders in their browser, you realize you need to rethink a lot of layers along the way there. And I already see people in chat, what about Fastify? Fastify has basically the exact same API as Express. I love Fastify. I really do. I use it for a ton of stuff, but it isn't a replacement or a rethinking of Express. It is just a faster version of Express. We haven't rethought these things at their core. And that's what's exciting here is after the last decade of building this way, using this huge pile of tools across the ecosystem to build awesome stuff, no one sat down and tried to pick the best parts. We've had things like Bun that did this to Node, but they're as focused on compatibility as they are on like new features. No one's done this for the set of tools we build applications with. And no, your favorite random server-side thing like Elysia or Hano is not this either. All of these are rough abstractions on serving routes. None of these are rethinkings. None of these are attempts to change how a URL becomes an experience. And I really like the idea of starting from first principles to make building good applications easier. And not just for humans, but for LLMs too. Now is one of the last moments this can happen. And I am very excited to see what they end up doing with it. And I'm even more excited to see how the market responds to it. Someone in chat just said the key piece, new Rails. That is how Ryan framed it with me. What if we built something like Rails, but instead of it trying really hard to look like English and run like shit, it instead tried to use web standards to make great experiences? If instead of pretending the browser was useless and ignoring it, it built using the browser standards as a shared language between the server and the client? What if we really deeply rethought how we build the web with JavaScript using everything we've learned over the last 10 years? And I am so excited to see if they can pull it off. Genuinely. This is not meant to be a slight in even the littlest bits towards TanStack Start and the TanStack stuff that Tanner's doing. I love all of his work. TanStack Router is super promising and it's one of our top picks for where we'll end up with for T3 chat. Nor is it a slight at Next.js, which funny enough, for T3 chat, we're using Next.js alongside React Router. It's a hilarious stack, but we're doing it. It works great. I'm excited to see where all of these things go. But I'm really excited to see people who know what is great and terrible about both the web and the tools we use to build for it, taking everything they've learned and trying to distill it into a single solution. And even if it ends up failing, which statistically speaking, it probably will, we will still learn so much from it. Yeah, I'm excited as hell to see where this goes. So my message to Ryan and Michael and everyone else working on this is that you have my full backing. I am so excited to see where this goes, and I hope you'll continue to keep me in the loop as the project develops. The future of the web is brighter than ever, and I am so excited to see people who have been shepherding it for the last 10 years take the opportunity to look forward and figure out what the next 10 years look like. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Am I way overhyping this thing that doesn't exist, or is there a real cool opportunity here? Curious what y'all think. Until next time, peace, nerds.